for the because of the changed location. It's about 5:36 now, and we'll get going. My name is Peter Demas. I am with the legal unit at the Department of Environmental Services. I'll be moderating this hearing. This hearing is being held to receive public comment on 3 sets of rules proposed by the Department of Environmental Services related to the regulation of 4 perfluorochemicals, or PFCs. Specifically, the rules are ENV DW 7 and 800, establishing maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, for the 4 PFCs in drinking water, and adding monitoring, compliance, and reporting and public notice requirements for the 4 PFCs. Want it closer? Okay. Okay. There we go. Next is ENV OR 60303, establishing ambient groundwater quality standards, or AGQSs, for the 4 PFCs that are required by statute to be equivalent to the MCLs established in ENV DW 700. And then ENV WQ 402, establishing water quality standards for discharges to groundwater of wastewater containing any of the 4 PFCs. The rulemaking notices for these rules were published in the New Hampshire Rulemaking Register on January 24th, 2019, as notice numbers 2019-14, 2019-15, and 2019-16. This hearing is the first of 3 public hearings being held as indicated in those notices. For those of you who are interested, there is another hearing scheduled for tomorrow in Concord, and then next Tuesday in Portsmouth. Anyone wishing to make oral comments or to submit written comments on the rules for the department's consideration may do so at this hearing. Written comments on the rules may be submitted to the department by the close of business, which is 4 p.m. on April 12th, 2019. A couple of brief comments on the nature of the hearing, specifically what it is and what it is not. As noted earlier, this hearing is being held to allow interested parties an opportunity to testify and offer comments on the rules. The department is here to listen to your comments and receive any written materials you wish to submit. This hearing is not a presentation on the rules, nor is it an adjudicative hearing or a debate on the merits of what's in the rules. This is your opportunity to voice your opinion on the rules to the department. DES staff knowledgeable about the content of the rules are here, and they may be able to answer questions clarifying any issues that may come up, but their primary reason is to sit here and listen to you and take notes so that we can consider your comments in the future. The hearing is not about the investigations with which you're all familiar, and it's not about the process of remediating. So again, just about the rules. After the close of the comment period, the department will consider all comments received and will decide whether to revise the rules in response to the comments. The department will file its final proposed rules for consideration by the Joint Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules and will post the final proposed rules on its online rulemaking page. We anticipate that the rules will be on the JLCAR agenda for its May or June meeting, although that date is subject to change. So let me briefly explain the rules. Last year, the legislature enacted legislation directing DES to initiate rulemaking by January 1st, 2019 to, first, set MCLs, that's maximum contaminant levels, for PFOA, PFOS, PFNA, and PFHxS. MCLs are drinking water standards that public water systems, such as the Merrimack Village District, must comply with. In addition, DES was directed to reevaluate the current AGQSs for PFOA and PFOS, which is currently 70 parts per trillion combined. Sure. I'll do my best. And to establish AGQSs for PFHxS and PFNA. AGQSs are cleanup standards for contaminated sites. It should be noted that existing statutes have always required an AGQS to be the same as any established MCL for a contaminant. The AGQSs are also used to determine appropriate discharge limits for groundwater discharge permits. In response to the legislative directive, DES has proposed the following rules, which are the subject of tonight's hearing. ENV DW 700 and 800. They establish the MCLs, monitoring, compliance, reporting, and public notice requirements for the 4 PFCs that will apply to all community and non-transient public water systems. This is as required by RSA 4516E. The proposed MCLs are for PFOA, 38 parts per trillion. For PFOS, 70 parts per trillion. For combined PFOA and PFOS, also 70 parts per trillion. For PFNA, 23 parts per trillion. And for PFHxS, 85 parts per trillion. The rules would also eliminate the requirement for the owner or operator of a laboratory that is seeking approval for an alternate analysis method to identify the specific public water system for which the alternate method would be used, meaning that once an alternate method is approved, it could be used for any public water system. The next rule is ENV OR 60303. This would be amended to revise the existing AGQS for PFOA and PFOS, and to add AGQSs for PFNA and PFHxS. This is required by RSA 485C6, and those are required to be identical to the MCLs that were established under ENVDW 7 and 800, which we just talked about. ENVWQ 402 would establish requirements for discharges to groundwater of wastewater containing any of the 4 PFCs. Those requirements reflect the proposed changes to the AGQSs that would be established under the rule we just talked about, ENVOR 60303. And they are intended to accommodate the lack of available technology to treat wastewater that is contaminated with certain PFCs. Specifically, the rules would include residual PFOA, PFOS, PFNA, and PFHxS in the existing conditional exemption for meeting AGQSs under certain circumstances. They would establish a discharge limit for PFOA, PFOS, PFNA, and PFHxS in wastewater discharge to groundwater. They would also account for exceedances of the applicable limits for the 4 PFCs. They would also include those 4 PFCs in the treatment alternative response requirement established for 1,4-dioxane, which includes identifying and eliminating contributing discharges to the wastewater stream. So before we get going, I'd just like to cover some procedural matters. If you wish to speak, we ask that you please sign in and fill out a card, one of these slips that was available when you walked in. If you wish to speak and didn't get one, please go grab one. And just put on your name, your affiliation if you have any. Someone will collect them and pass them up here, and when I call your name, you can step to the microphone right here in the middle to make your comments. We anticipate that there will be a good amount of comments on these rules, and because we have a limited amount of time, we ask you to please be respectful of those who want to comment after you, and try to keep your comments limited to 3 to 5 minutes. It's not a hard, fast rule, but remember, others want to speak. If there's something that you haven't covered, and somebody hasn't covered after you've had a chance, then, and we still have time, feel free to come back up afterwards, but initially let's try to keep it somewhat tight. If you plan to speak and submit written comments, you don't have to read your written comments into the record. If you want to summarize your comments that are in writing for the room, that's fine, but whatever you submit to us in writing will be part of the record. You don't have to read it into the record tonight. That will save a significant amount of time. If others who have testified before you have made the same comments, feel free to indicate your support for those who have spoken before you and with whom you agree, but you don't have to reiterate those comments again. Again, saving time for those who wish to speak after you. All right, and the other thing is we are recording this hearing and have a stenographer here to help capture the comments. Please try to speak clearly and towards the microphone, and as I've been told, maybe slow down a little bit too. All right, so with that, let's get the hearing underway. I'm just going to go right to the first of our slips that's been submitted, and that is for Jeff Daly, who wishes to comment on all 3 of the rules. Evening, Mr. Daly.
Good evening. My name is Jeff Daly. I live at 74 Walden Pond Drive, Nashua, New Hampshire. And my main concern is back in January, when we had the first iteration and review of the MCL approach, it was found out that New Hampshire DES had used the wrong scientific equations to come up with the MCLs. During that meeting, it was admitted that if the taken into account breastfeeding, blood placenta passing, and in vitro, those numbers would have immediately come down by 2/3. When we look around at the Minnesota work that has been done, in there are, and I will be submitting separately, equations on how to work this all out, but was never used. It was pushed on one side. The Minnesota report is very, very thorough. The New Jersey report is very, very thorough. They all come down into virtually the double digits, 10, 12, 14 parts per trillion. Some people are now talking in New Jersey of 1 part per trillion. And I think, and I go back to the June meeting in Exeter with then Administrator Alexandra Dunn and Peter Gravett, and they both agreed, if they could, they put it at 0 until proven otherwise. Now, the state of New Hampshire has the right to do the same thing under the TSCA and the Clean Water Act for drinking water. You could level those down to 0 if you wanted. Yes, there may be a cost to it, but that can be worked out, and I feel that you should not, at this moment in time, present anything to the legislators other than the lowest possible number, not this 38 and 70. And making a combined of 38 and 70 to be 70, the math doesn't work. When you go and look at every single report out, the combined is the two numbers added together, not the two numbers to make a lower level. And if you take into account the PFHxS, 78, you add that all in, it still doesn't come back to 70. Somebody's doing fuzzy math. You won't be able to fool the public any longer. We have very highly qualified scientists at Notre Dame, University of North Carolina, Alabama, Harvard, and Tufts University who absolutely are going through everything, and they're saying somebody is fiddling around because they don't want to accept responsibility. Since 1954, 3M have known, and the EPA has known. The FDA put out a report banning PFAS on food wrappings in 1966. In July of 2017, they gave Daikin permission to start coating papers that are going to be used for food wrapping. The major one being popcorn. They did not go back beyond 1970 to check if any prohibition had been made for coating of papers with PFAS. No one in this state is even looking at the landfill side of things. We have Dr. Graham Peasley out at Notre Dame who said that paper will disintegrate and every single part of that PFAS coating will go into the landfill, into the groundwater, or into the leachate, and then it goes into the wastewater. We know New Hampshire DES has checked wastewater and you're getting PFAS. Not large numbers, but they're still numbers. The Pennachuck Brook is contaminated. Nobody's gone in and checked that recently, but there is a well there that turns up on your map at 328 parts per trillion. It's actually 329 parts per trillion. We've had that checked by Eurofins. So you have the rights to lower the levels, and I implore you to do it and not put it onto the legislation for them to come up with a number. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Daly. Okay, next is Catherine Hodge.
Back in February at the EPA announcement, Alexandra Dunn was asked why Vermont has a total combined level of 20 parts per trillion for 5, not 4 PFAS like we do here. Her response was that Vermont used science for the most vulnerable, which are the infants and children, to come to their levels. Vermont set their levels in 2016. We are in 2019, and we're still studying things. We're still testing things. The 5 combined that Vermont has, like I said, are at 20. New Hampshire, for the 4 that we're looking at, totals 216 PPT. That's for 4, not 5. There's a 196 parts per trillion difference between us and Vermont. So how about we stop using full-grown men in our studies and start using kids and infants? If Vermont can come up with 20 PPT for 5, we can do it. And there's one chemical that Vermont added into theirs. It's PFHPA. Looking at a couple months worth of chemicals that are coming out of St. Gobain, the levels for those are over 2,000. Over 2,000 for the exact same chemical that is included in the Vermont PPT, which, like I said, is at 20. So if New Hampshire is using science based on adults, they are also saying that it is for immediate exposure of 1 year or less, when we have been exposed to these chemicals for 20 plus years and are still being exposed to these chemicals on a daily basis, mostly by the air, which settles into the soil, which then goes into the groundwater, which then contaminates all of our water. Merrimack is a total aquifer. When are you guys going to start protecting us? Every single ounce of water is contaminated. You guys need to step up and do something. New York and New Jersey have low numbers as well. So why is New Hampshire not doing at least as much as they are? They know what their costs were going to be, but they thought that human health protection was most important. So why isn't it to New Hampshire? I've been living in Merrimack for 16 years. I live 1.1 miles away from St. Gobain. My own health issues, I've had thyroid biopsies. Thank God no cancer was found. In 2016, I lost 2/3 of my right kidney. No family history of anything. Now this is going to be a lifetime of concern for myself, for my family. It's going to worry me for my entire life. It's going to worry my husband and my children for the rest of their lives. Do you guys understand the cost to me and my family and everybody else in Merrimack that has had to have surgeries, medications, all because of known exposure? Kidney cancer is on the list of known exposure for these chemicals. It's going to be a lifetime of testing for me. Every 6 months, I have to go in and get retested for my kidney to see if the cancer has come back. Do you know what kind of stress that causes? I don't think you do unless you've been in my position. My daughter did her first cancer run when she was 11 years old in support of me. That's absolutely pathetic that an 11-year-old has to have a sign in support of my mom on her back. My husband is a retired military person. What was he exposed to before? I don't know. What is he still being exposed to now? Basically, for me, I'm screwed if this happens again. And like I said, this is all known exposure. Kidney cancer is on the list. My husband has health issues that will shorten his lifespan and will create many health issues along the way. Is this okay? Do you care about the cost of our health care? Do you care about what we're pulling out of our pockets on a monthly basis, on a weekly basis, even on a yearly basis? And you're concerned about cleanup costs for a multi-billion-dollar company that's contaminating us? I think not. My daughter, who is 14 now, has health issues. At 11 years old, she was put on medication. She will continue to be on this medication until the doctors can figure out exactly what's going on or until certain levels get balanced out. All of her issues are known exposure related as well. So please stop denying that the health issues are there. We will have a lifetime of worries with my daughter. What's going to happen when she tries to have children of her own? Is she going to pass the PFAS down to her babies? Is it going to be in her babies when she chooses to breastfeed? Is it going to be in her babies when she chooses to use contaminated water to make their formula? Think about the long term. Don't think about the short term. My daughter also has asthma. She was diagnosed at 5 years of age. 5 years old. She's only breathed Merrimack air. So that's another concern of ours. Do you know what the cost of an inhaler is? Our copay for one of her inhalers is $120. That's every single month. Add up that cost, and then you tell me that Saint-Gobain can't pay to fix our water. We know that they've created this. We know that they have the money to fix it. So do your jobs, please, and get them to pay for it. It shouldn't come down to us having to pay for what they've created. So whether you guys decide to do the right thing and look at people over industry, or a multi-billion-dollar company over the health of the people that you technically work for, I hope you can all sleep at night knowing that you have put a dollar value on everybody in Merrimack and on all of our future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hodge. Okay, next up is Town Council Member Barbara Healy. Good evening, Ms. Healy.
Good evening. Nice to see all of you. Thank you for coming down to Merrimack today. You know, I know you've just heard about the Minnesota study and the results that have come out just recently in their republishing, because they've been fairly, you know, a lot more testing was done on cord blood versus newborn versus children into early childhood. So I'm here today not to speak to you as a town councilor, but to speak to you as a registered nurse with over 40 years of experience. And you know, one thing that they tell pregnant women is don't take aspirin, don't drink caffeine, don't drink alcohol, don't smoke, and don't sit in hot tubs either. I missed that one. But you know, what we have here as well is a chemical substance and compounds that is in our drinking water. And only in the last few years have we really begun to see studies that are looking at what are the upper limits of those levels in the bloodstream and what do they do. And there aren't enough studies to be done with that. So I think what I'm asking you today is to consider a few other things when you're looking at that Minnesota study, as well as other studies that have come to the forefront in the last couple of months since you first published what the proposed MCLs would be. And that is look at lower levels, because ultimately plastic and fluorines don't belong in the body. And secondly, also think about the other PFAS compounds in that family and the new Gen X as they start taking carbon compounds out of the equation to try to make a more acceptable product overall. So again, if women who are pregnant can't take all of those drugs and can't take medicine for their colds, let's not put PFAS into the water at any level, and let's take it out. Because as you know and I know, this is only the tip of the iceberg. As more and more communities begin to test for this compound, they're going to find they have it in their water as well. So let's get ahead of the curve and be a little more protective, and at least, you know, look at some of the newer studies that have come out. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next is Donald Preventure. MVD Commissioner. I hope I pronounced your name right.
What's that?
I hope I pronounced your name right.
Preventure.
Okay.
Close enough. Thank you for coming here tonight. I know this is important to everybody. I am a citizen of Merrimack. I'm also an MVD commissioner, Merrimack Village District, but I'm here to speak on my own behalf. I'm not representing the MVD tonight. I did have an opportunity to go through the summary of the development of the MCLs report that was put forth, and I just have a few things that I wanted to present here. The first thing is I'm not sure where the 4 compounds were selected from. I know other states have more compounds, 5, 6. One of the concerning things is, as a commissioner, to know that we want to make sure that we're serving the best water that we can to our residents. PFHxS is not regulated, but when you look at the test results in MVD's wells, that compound is actually higher than PFOS and PFHxS, which are regulated in wells 2 and 3. So I'm a little bit concerned of what does that mean when PFHxA is higher than other compounds that are regulated, but the PFHxA is not being regulated. That's a little concerning to me that that's being sort of omitted, and it's somewhat higher than other PFAS compounds in our water. I wish that would have been addressed. When we look at the MVD customer, which is essentially almost all of Merrimack and beyond, Bedford, some locations, we've already been exposed as far back as I understand, back in probably even the late 80s when ChemFab was preceded Saint-Gobain. That exposure has become evident in the DHHS blood study that was done a couple of years ago, which concluded that the average MVD customer's blood levels of PFOA, PFOS were double the national average. That puts the MVD customer at sort of an already disadvantaged exposure level. Now, these exposure limits, these MCLs that are being considered, I'm not sure if the baseline blood levels, I'm assuming, are representative of the national average. But right here in Merrimack, we're double the national average. So it would seem that these levels might be too high for certain people who have already been exposed to certain levels of these chemicals. And that's a little concerning to me. I'm not sure we're accounting for that in the MCLs. The other parts I wanted to speak about are just related to the costs and benefits. And I think from our last meeting here in the town hall a couple months ago, I believe that costs were not yet considered in these MCLs. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but at some point, if costs are going to be considered, and I got to think that they are, it says on one of these page 11s in this report that DS does not regulate private well water, and there are some costs in here that are provided that deal with estimated costs to treat private wells. So I'm not really sure if that's factored in or if it's going to be factored in the cost of treating private wells. But I do know the cost of public water treatment is definitely something that's going to be considered, I would imagine. And I was looking at some of the numbers that were derived on page 78 of the report. It actually does cite some of MVD wells because, as you know, Saint-Gobain is paying part of the cost of treating wells 4 and 5 that have contamination over the current 70 limit. And those are accurate, obviously, but there's other costs in here that I don't think are accurate, like an $8 million cost for treating wells 7 and 8. What I wanted to do is to point out that MVD did commission a PFAS study that was done by one of our consulting engineers, Underwood Engineers. And there is more accurate data that I would want to point you to use for cost estimates on that. It's on the MVD's website. It's a thorough report that the commission had authorized because we wanted to know what would be the cost we'd be faced with if we decided to pursue treatment on the other wells that are below the 70 limit, or if these MCLs dropped low enough that we would be required to have to put treatment on. So there is better information out there, and I would certainly recommend, I could send it to you if you want, but it is on the MVD's website.
You should submit that.
Okay.
Feel free to do so.
I will do so. And the last question I had here, which I don't know if you want to answer, or maybe I can submit this as a question as well, but on page 16 in this report, it talks about benefits to affected parties. And there's a sentence in here, it says NHDES researched the subject of benefit quantification and spoke with experts, including a group of professors and researchers at the University of New Hampshire. I was just curious on who those professors are. So I'll send you a written question on that. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sandy LaFleur? No comments? Okay, thank you. Laureen Allen, co-founder of the Merrimack Citizens for Clean Water.
Good evening. Is that on? Hello?
Should have a green light, yes.
3 years ago, we became aware that Merrimack and several surrounding communities were identified by the EPA as a PFAS contamination site that we now know is at least 65 square miles. 15 years ago, prior to our awareness, NHDES archives show memos of concerns with PFAS chemicals released from Saint-Gobain Performance Plastics via air emissions that we now know have contaminated and continue to contaminate groundwater, waterways, aquifers, soil, wells, wastewater generated biosolids and compost, and no doubt our local food chain. We are a PFAS impacted community with long-term exposure to what we now know is a bioaccumulative class of chemicals that do not break down and have been linked to thousands of health studies showing their harm. Dr. Ben Chan of DHHS clarified last year in public comment that our blood serum in Merrimack will not decrease until we can stop exposure to these chemicals. That was a powerful statement when I heard that. We in Merrimack and surrounding communities bear a disproportionate burden of harm as compared to the rest of New Hampshire, and the time to act is now to not only protect us from harm, but to give us rights to stop the accumulation of contamination and place the cost of remediation on the polluters whose actions put these chemicals in our drinking water sources. NHDES was thankfully legislated to review health science and incorporate research that pertained the most sensitive endpoints and most vulnerable populations, infants, into maximum contaminant level recommendations. For only 4 of the many PFAS we're exposed to in this community on a daily basis with active and direct source identified pollution. The proposed levels of 38 PFOA, 70 PFOS, 23 PFNA, and 85 PFHxS do not do that, and thus cannot be in good conscience become law. Over the last 3 years, I have dedicated as much time to PFAS impacts in exposed communities as I have to my social work practice. Why? Because despite being told that we have had a relatively low exposure level as compared to the current EPA health advisory of 70 parts per trillion, which we know is not protective, I have come to believe that health disruptions that I have seen, not only in my entire family and many, many others in this town, are associated with long-term PFAS exposure. We know from blood tests taken as recently as this year in Hoosick Falls, New York, where residents have had higher exposure than we have had, sadly, but to the same chemical class and formulas with the same polluter, interestingly, that babies are now being born with high levels of PFAS in their blood serum, despite their parents having fully filtered public water, and they stopped their exposure 4 years ago. I reviewed all the information NHDES considered to formulate MCLs and their methodology, and upon first read, I was surprised to see that the most sensitive endpoints that other states, such as New Jersey, Vermont, New York, and now Pennsylvania, have utilized in their formulations and were not chosen. I have heard and read the reasoning and the rationale that has been communicated to us of only using the most definitive science. This rationale does not serve our citizens, and we do not accept this approach. I will leave the scientific discussion of which endpoints, reference dosage, and uncertainty factors are truly protective to the scientists who specialize in this environmental health area, as they are paying attention, and I know they will comment with full references in our process. I will close by saying that it is unacceptable to exclude categories of studies that other states have concluded are the most sensitive endpoints and have the greatest potential for harm. These studies include memory tissue and delayed development for PFOA, immune response and immune suppression for PFOS. Not only are these disruptions in development in the formative years likely to play out across the lifetime, but where is the crucial attention to using a precautionary overall uncertainty factor, as we know in this area we have had long-term and will endure ongoing exposure of an entire class of PFAS, unrecognized fully in this process, but truly the elephant in the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Allen. Representative Wendy Thomas. Uni Representative Thomas.
Thank you for having me here. As stated, my name is Representative Wendy Thomas. I live on 10 Wildcat Falls Road here in Merrimack. Just would like to read a short statement. The drinking water in the private well at my home on Wildcat Falls Road in Merrimack tested at 49 parts per trillion for PFOA, one of the toxic group of chemicals in Merrimack's groundwater linked to cancer, thyroid disease, and other illnesses in people exposed to them. That's under 70 parts per trillion, so it's considered a safe, and that's in quotation marks, contamination level by an Environmental Protection Agency health advisory, a guideline for chronic lifetime exposure set last year. It's also considered safe by the state of New Hampshire DES, which follows the same guidelines. What needs to be considered is this. Is a safe PFOA level a matter of geography? If my home were in New Jersey instead of New Hampshire, my contamination level wouldn't just be considered unsafe, it would be 3.5 times above a proposed legal limit of 14 ppt for PFOA in drinking water there. If I lived in New Jersey, my health would be better protected from contaminated water than it is now in New Hampshire. And PFOA is just one of the 8 similar chemicals in our well. Only one other of which, PFOS, has had any federal exposure guidelines. The PFOA and PFOS combined in our well is 53.8 parts per trillion. New Hampshire can and must do better for its residents who are being exposed to these toxic chemicals. The MCLs for these chemicals must be drastically lowered. Our health and safety should not be jeopardized simply because we happen to live in the wrong state. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Shayna Casper.
Hi,
Hi.
my name is Shayna Casper. I'm the Vermont, New Hampshire State Director at Toxics Action Center. At Toxics Action Center, we believe that everyone has the right to breathe clean air and drink clean water and live in a healthy and sustainable community with a government that operates responsibly and democratically. We envision a toxic-free world where we phase out harmful chemicals from manufacturing. We do everything possible to clean up our toxic legacies of past mistakes. So we provide side-by-side community organizing assistance to slow down. Thank you. It's always a problem. Thank you. So we provide training for folks facing environmental hazards in their neighborhoods. And so for 30 years, our role has been helping first-time activists to facing pollution threats in their neighborhoods. And nowhere has this been more important than in the past few years with communities affected by PFAS. So as was mentioned earlier, chemical companies have exploited loopholes in our country's safe drinking water laws for decades, meaning that communities are not required to test for these chemicals, much less to clean them up. And there's no enforceable federal drinking water standard for PFAS, leaving these regulations up to the states. And these chemicals have been linked from everything from kidney disorders and cancers and more. I'm sure you've heard from some folks, and you'll continue to hear from others tonight about these health impacts that these chemicals cause. And to make matters worse, the Environmental Working Group estimates that this contaminant is in the drinking water of 110 million people living in this country. Granite Staters deserve to know that the water is safe to drink. And this means that we must be precautionary, which has already also been discussed. And so after working with a number of groups in Vermont and New Hampshire and elsewhere across the region, at a national conference in Boston in June 2017, community leaders, including folks in Merrimack, were inspired by these new ideas from others facing similar threats and wanted to collaborate to make change both in their own backyards and at the broader national level. And that's why they launched the National PFAS Contamination Coalition. It has now grown to 25 community groups in 15 states and Guam who have joined together to share information, gain skills, connect with experts, and work on state and national campaigns together for solutions to build a collaborative and powerful force to take on some of the country's biggest polluters. The coalition envisions a PFAS-free world where people are not exposed to any PFAS, where poisoned people's health is protected, where there is justice for harms and deaths from past exposures, and where regulations change so that nothing like this can happen again. Strong MCLs, discharge limits, AGQSs, and others at the state and federal level are a first step in working towards this vision. Today, there's almost 5,000 PFAS substances in use. We don't even know how many because of how broken our chemical regulatory system is. All chemicals are similar to these 4 that are tested and are highly persistent. And studies are showing that newer PFAS chemicals have similar health impacts as these legacy chemicals, and most have not even been studied at all. So we need to be treating this chemical as a class, and we cannot take a chemical by chemical approach. This emerging regulatory patchwork also raises concerns that some Americans are not adequately protected. And states have the resources and technical know-how to conduct their own risk assessments, but others may lack their funding and expertise. So while we need to continue pushing forward on these, we also need to be moving for meaningful federal action. And it is abysmal that it is up to the states to take action in the absence of federal action. Jeff has already mentioned some of the state action that has already been taken for PFOA, PFOS, and others. And of these, Vermont, Minnesota, New Jersey have all adopted levels that are more stringent than EPA's current non-enforceable standards and from New Hampshire's. New York and California have also proposed stronger guideline levels as well, and Pennsylvania officials also recently announced that they'd create their own standards, citing concerns about EPA's sluggish efforts to address this issue. Other states are doing more, and New Hampshire should not just be pushing for stronger federal regulations, but also should be a leader and not a follower in this work, due to the number of impacted people that you have heard from and will continue to hear from until this meaningful change has happened. Other states are considering the full body of scientific evidence on health risks associated with exposure to this class of chemicals when setting safe limits in drinking water. Other states are considering effects on sensitive populations, such as pregnant women and children, which is what you've already heard of today as well. And so New Hampshire must do the same. And I'll submit further comments by written comments by the April deadline. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Casper. Okay, Caryl De Pierrot from Merrimack Citizens for Clean Water.
Caryl De Pierrot, Merrimack,
Evening.
New Hampshire, and I'm going to apologize because a lot of what I had said has been said, so I don't want to repeat it, but I'm going to shuffle papers here for a second.
Thank you.
It troubles me that there are these other studies out there that seem to keep getting discounted, like New Jersey. The ATSDR came out with much lower numbers. They were looking at child exposure levels. They came out with numbers of like 14 parts per trillion for PFOS, 21 parts per trillion for PFOA, 21 parts per trillion for PFNA, and so on. And basically, they're anticipating that these numbers are going to recommended the limits are going to be going down. So I don't know what we're waiting for. There is the cost to the individual that you heard about. So when you're factoring in the cost to the water systems, there are a lot of people in town that are bearing medical costs because of this. And I don't know how that's going to fit into your equation. I'm guessing it's not. I know that there are people who are not here to speak for themselves because they are dead or they have moved because of the water situation in this town. I remember when the governor first spoke and he said that we should be able to trust our tap water. What happened to that? You guys are the organization to put that in place, so I'm expecting that to happen. And here, just in some of our own monitoring wells, this isn't in the drinking water per se, but we know water doesn't have boundaries. It just flows. We have a monitoring well right next to St. Gobain that measures 19,000 parts per trillion. Where do you think that's going to go? It's going to seep into our water supply or somebody's private well. We have to act. These are dangerous, and as many people have said before me, it seems like a lot of the studies that are getting discounted and ignored are not considering the youngest, the babies, the child development issues, which is one of the main reasons I got involved in this whole issue. We need to look at the biggest picture. Consider that PFAS is a class of around 3,000 chemicals and not 4. But I'm okay with starting with 4 or 5 as long as we keep pushing forward. These chemicals are in our air. I developed asthma shortly after I moved to Merrimack. And now I'm drinking it. And when you set these limits, as somebody else said, you are negligent if you do not consider towns like Merrimack and Coakley and all those areas that have had high exposure, if you do not aim for the lowest number possible. Because somehow, how do we get this out of our bodies? I know I'm having health effects, and I worry every night about my family. So I think basically most of what I was going to say has been said. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to quote Tom Brady and ask you to please do your job.
Thank you, Ms. De Pierrot. Okay. Jean Porter from the Lower Merrimack River Advisory Committee. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Porter. Dr. Katherine Peltz. The Endocrine Disruption Campaign. Or exchange.
Exchange.
Sorry, I guess.
Hello, good evening, and thank you for this opportunity to provide the comments. Dr. Katherine Peltz I'm a senior scientist at the Endocrine Disruption Exchange. We're a nonprofit research organization, and I am also a citizen of New Hampshire, so I'm here on my behalf as well. So I think it's important to start out by highlighting, as we've heard, that New Hampshire Senate Bill 309 specifically stated that the commissioner shall adopt standards that reasonably protect public health, particularly prenatal and early childhood health. Unfortunately, the MCLs currently proposed by DES fail to do that. Developing children are the most at risk of the long-term effects from PFAS exposure. There are two reasons for this. First, the fetal and early childhood life stages are the time the body systems are being established and developed. Small changes that disrupt or permanently alter the course of development can increase the risk of later life disease. Second, the U.S. EPA has noted that infants and children consume more drinking water per unit body weight. Infants may be exposed to PFAS via contaminated breast milk and/or by infant formula that is prepared with PFAS-contaminated water. It is important that these factors are adequately accounted for in the MCL calculation process, since developing children are both the most sensitive population as well as the population with the highest estimated exposure. So DES should take two steps to better protect this vulnerable population. First, DES should use exposure assumptions based on infants for the derivation of MCLs. Instead, DES has used a water ingestion rate for lactating women of 0.055 liters per kilogram per day. While this is more protective than the ingestion estimation for a man or non-lactating woman, it is not protective enough for infants. The Vermont Department of Health has used a value of 0.175 liters per kilogram per day, which represents the 95th percentile of body weight adjusted water intake rate for the first year of life, as has been calculated by the U.S. EPA. I encourage New Hampshire DES to do the same. Using this ingestion assumption would lower the current MCLs by a factor of threefold. At a minimum, DES should explore the use of the new toxicokinetic model that incorporates chemical-specific properties and exposure parameters for early life stages, as we've heard about, that's been developed by the Minnesota Department of Health for PFOA and PFOS. Of course, in doing so, DES should ensure that they base their calculations on the lower reference doses that they have already proposed, rather than the higher one that is used by Minnesota Department of Health in the derivation of the model. The second step DES should do to better protect prenatal and early childhood health is to properly acknowledge health effects that are known to occur after developmental exposure to very low levels of PFAS. This could be done by either choosing a study with a more sensitive endpoint on which to base the calculation, or by applying more protective uncertainty factors. For example, there is strong evidence linking developmental PFOA exposure to delays in mammary gland development. The New Jersey Drinking Water Quality Institute has stated that these delays in mammary gland development are, quote, considered to be adverse because structural changes in the mammary gland persist until adulthood, and that there is no reason to discount its human relevance. Furthermore, 3 human studies report that PFOA is associated with decreased duration of breastfeeding, a parameter which has not been adequately studied in rodents. New Hampshire DES should therefore either base the MCL calculations for PFOA on delays in mammary gland development or apply the full uncertainty factor of 10. Likewise, the MCL for PFOS should be either based on the immune system effects or a full uncertainty factor of 10 should be applied. So for PFNA, it's not quite clear why DES has not chosen to use the same uncertainty factors as those used by the New Jersey Drinking Water Quality Institute, especially considering the database limitations that DES acknowledges, including a lack of a human serum half-life and studies on mammary gland development and neurobehavioral outcomes. Furthermore, in reading the January 2019 summary report today, I noticed that the recent findings on testosterone levels, fertility, and sperm number, motility, and viability from prepubertal PFNA exposure that were mentioned to DES by the New Jersey Drinking Water Quality Institute were not included or mentioned.
and I think that this should be revisited. In conclusion, the MCL values currently proposed by DES are not protective of prenatal and early childhood health, as was required by New Hampshire Senate Bill 309. DES should use exposure assumptions based on infants for the derivation of MCLs and better acknowledge the growing evidence of health effects from developmental exposures to low levels of PFAS.
Thank you, Dr. Peltz. Margaret O'Neill. Excuse me, no comment? Thank you. William O'Neill? Okay, thank you. Kristen Ayers?
My name is Kristen Ayers.
Ms.
I
Ayers.
am a Merrimack resident. Thank you for meeting with us today. I just want to clarify, I apologize, I came in a few minutes late. Are you all DES? Okay, thank
Yes.
you. I'm aware that you are not only here because you are only here because you are required to be here. So let's not pretend you're here to help us. If you were, we wouldn't have to beg you time and time again to do your job. Personally, I find it gross and positively nauseating that we as a community had to fight to even get this meeting in our own town, our contaminated town, and not in Concord as previously scheduled by you, Clark. If that doesn't speak volumes to what you think of our town, huh? And you want us to stop talking on social media to get awareness out there and complaining about DES, which was said in our last town meeting by DES. Yeah, well, that's our right. And if you won't do anything, or should I say do the right thing, well, I guess it's up to us. So Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter it is. So let me get to my point. We are the largest contaminated community in our great, beautiful state of New Hampshire. People in Merrimack, as well as other nearby towns such as Bedford and Litchfield, have been dosed and continue to be dosed every second of every darn day with unnatural, man-made PFAS chemicals in our everyday lives. There are at least 34 PFAS in the St. Gobain, our biggest polluter, report summaries. This contamination, guess what? It's not decreasing. In fact, as their reports indicate, it's increasing. We have an active polluter. This is fact and cannot be disputed. This harm to our environment impacts our air, water, soil, game, fish, as well as crops at local farms. All things that impact us every day. Clark, I recall us discussing after our October meeting, off the side, the long time that DES has granted St. Gobain to complete the fish tissue samples, nearly a year. Have they submitted their samples yet? I read thoroughly your emails and check your website, and I haven't seen anything yet. It is fact that fish and game in contaminated communities across the country have shown high levels of PFAS in random samples. So why do we not expedite this request from last year and have the samples done now? Here's my concern. You are not gaining appropriate information needed to make conclusions regarding our community's level of contamination. You're just not doing it. Just like the blood samples. And don't even get me going on our continued lack of access to blood tests. Another example, you tested how many of St. Gobain's 13 smokestacks? And what specifically did you test for? And how many PFAS are found in St. Gobain's reports from their stacks? Come on, 34 at least, that we know of. Let's get what we need, the information we need to fix this problem, and hold the polluter responsible. It's enough. These chemicals are proven to be bioaccumulative, something I didn't even know was a thing as a teacher. I had no clue what that was. Well, having taken the time to educate myself and others in my community, I can say we don't want this junk in our water. As we have learned from research, we are very concerned, very frustrated, very angry. You might notice that. And we'll remain very active on this issue. Our community needs to be cleaned up. These chemicals are not going anywhere. They will be here for hundreds of years, what some studies show. Trust me, we will not give up due to lack of action from our state, from lack of doing what's right and putting the most protective measures in place. Instead of worrying about cost analysis, I can tell you there's a multi-billion-dollar company down the road that should be footing the bill for this. You have the power to do that. Our people are over being patient with you. We have grown immune to your non-answers and your non-action. Our citizens are angry that our community will not be protected or cleaned up without laws that you claim we need. I can remember our very first visit with you. You had a panel, and I asked a ton of questions. In fact, I was asked to stop, but I'm like, no, I'm not done. I waited for hours for you to talk. Now it's my turn, if you remember. I can remember, Clark, you saying, our hands are tied. We can't do anything. Yeah, well, poor you. We got people elected. We did what you asked. We got bills written. You were so full of malarkey, and you know it. What did you do with our efforts? You testify against them and conquered. Yeah, so don't think for a second that you were looking good in our eyes. I can't help but wonder why you still sing the praises of our state's biggest polluter, St. Gobain, and then testify against our efforts. Our community is not stupid. We are well aware that DES testified in specific times against Senate Bill 287, against Wendy Thomas's bill opening the possibility for blood testing. How is that helping us? Shame on you. You should be as disgusted as we are to be stuck without knowing what is in our bodies and at what levels, and continue to be dosed with. You have been provided science which shows that protective water standards are absolutely crucial to long-term bioaccumulative exposure, which our residents, our trusting, our caring, our beautiful, our innocent residents have been dosed with. We need the science-based laws that other states have that use the most vulnerable population, infants, and the most sensitive endpoints in the calculations. Do the right thing.
Thank you, Ms. Harris. Oh. All right. Wolfram Von Schoen, MVD Commissioner. Mr. Von Schoen.
Thank you. Wolfram von Schoen. Wolfram von Schoen, Merrimack citizen and resident and MD commissioner. I'm not a physician, I'm not a biologist, toxicologist, or any of these fancy things. I'm just an engineer. So I'm going to ask a simple and, in layman terms, formulated question, and that is, what makes New Hampshire DES believe that your logic, which is very transparent, by the way, which I think puts you in the position of being scrutinized and criticized and reviewed, and I appreciate that a lot. But what puts New Hampshire DES in the position to claim that our rather small state knows better than very large and very powerhouse capable states like New Hampshire, I'm sorry, New Jersey, of course, Pennsylvania, New York. There are states out there, even Minnesota is, large enough, I would think, that their DS is of a capacity that we may not be able to match. So I have not seen arguments in the report that justify the deviation versus those states that I believe personally to have larger capacities to study these efforts, these chemicals and their influences on the body. So I don't expect that answer today, but I would appreciate an answer to that question. What makes New Hampshire DES believe that we know better? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Von Schoen. Representative Rosemary Rung. Evening, Representative.
Thank you. I'm here as a resident, as a mother and grandmother to my family that lives in Merrimack. And I'm also here to represent the good people of Merrimack who've been dealing with this contamination for nearly 3 years that we know of. I want to encourage the Department of Environmental Service is to consider two factors as you proceed through rulemaking for PFAS maximum contaminant levels. One, increase the current uncertainty factor for PFOA and PFOS from 3 to 10, as concerns regarding mammary glands should be weighed more heavily in light of the Minnesota study. The January 10th, 2019 article, A Transgenerational Toxicokinetic Model and Its Use and Derivation of Minnesota PFOA Water Guidance, published in the Journal of Exposure Science and Environmental Epidemiology, raises alarming concerns for breastfed infants. As New Hampshire wants MCLs that are protective of human health, it must consider most seriously the health of the youngest of humans, as they have the highest risk of long-term exposure due to their young age. Number two, even though other studies may not directly conclude the role of PFAS in mammary gland cancers, it is suggested in several of the studies noted in the January 4th DES report. Also, New Hampshire has the highest rate of breast cancer in the country, and to err on the side of caution is very prudent. Thank you for inviting public comment during the rulemaking process, and I hope you will consider these comments in your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Kathy Stack.
Thank you. My name is Kathy Stack, and I am a representative from Merrimack. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak at this public hearing, and I do support all of the previous testimony given. I also speak on behalf of the many constituents I've heard from over the past several months regarding this issue. As you are aware, New Hampshire residents are exposed to PFOA, PFOS, and minimally 34 PFHs as identified in a recent Saint-Gobain report. These chemicals are not decreasing. Saint-Gobain remains an active pollutant in our town, and our community is being held captive, particularly if DES does not consider the lowest MCL for these chemicals. The current effort to only set the MCLs for a minimum amount of these PFAs may leave residents at risk due to exposure of the other non-regulated PFAs. The New Hampshire DES must consider the possibility, as populations chronically exposed to a number of PFAS may be considered a sensitive population in need of extra protection. In addition, in setting MCLs, New Hampshire must focus on the most vulnerable, whether that be infants or the elderly. Any fragile populations must be considered, and we should be looking at what the other states have done to address this problem. Proactive water standards are crucial to the long-term bioaccumulative exposure of our residents. Most of us in town have been exposed to these man-made toxic chemicals spewing from Saint-Gobain for years. I don't want to think that this town is being used as a guinea pig with DES complicit in the Saint-Gobain minimization and denial of the damage these chemicals continue to cause to our residents. You are playing a numbers game with people's lives. How many residents of Merrimack have to get sick and or die for you to be concerned with the pollution coming from this active pollutant? You continue to leave residents exposed to the harmful chemicals. As my well-esteemed colleague Shana mentioned about a sluggish effort being taken by you, it's brought to mind an analogy I have, where a person is drowning and yells out, "I'm drowning." The lifeguard says, "I'm coming." You're now going down for the third or fourth time, yet the lifeguard still sits there saying, "I'm coming." You are the lifeguards. We're drowning in this toxic chemical, and you are the lifeguards watching us drown. In considering the MCLs, please use science and common sense and protect our community before there's nothing left to protect.
Thank you, Representative Stack. Representative Nancy Murphy.
Good evening. Thank you for taking my comments. We're here tonight to address a problem for the entire state of New Hampshire: exposure to toxic PFAS chemicals that are not sufficiently or adequately regulated to protect us or our environment. In Merrimack, we are especially concerned as state-identified industrial polluter Saint-Gobain has made us captive victims in the largest known industry-related environmental disaster in our state's history. For that stigma, our state's #1 ranking in the nation for pediatric, breast, bladder, and esophageal cancer, likely impacted by environmental triggers, and the human health outcomes associated, we are both frustrated and angry. Our public drinking water and private wells are contaminated with dangerous chemicals that are known to be associated with human health harm. We must remember that those who manufacture these chemicals have never been held responsible for proving them safe. Despite the science that shows health harm associated with exposure, corporations are given the benefit of the doubt over citizens, allowing them to continue to pollute while the burden of proof falls on the victims of that exposure to prove harm. PFAS have been found in our public water supplies, private wells, and groundwater. Despite MBD's water PFAS levels currently testing lower than 70 ppt at the EPA advisory, this brings no comfort to me as a resident and MBD customer who since 2016 has continued to access every opportunity available to further educate myself as to these toxic chemicals and their effects on health. I am motivated to do so to protect my own health and that of my family, neighbors, friends, community, and the citizens of the state of New Hampshire. Though assured in the past by the EPA that safe exposure was 400 ppt, which was then reduced to 100 ppt and now to 70 ppt, reputable science, along with the CDC's own ATSDR, suggest otherwise. Sure. Own ATSDR suggests otherwise. Given the biodegradation and bioaccumulative properties of these toxic chemicals known to be associated with human health harm, serious action is warranted by regulators. Let's not forget that we have been long-term victims of PFAS exposure for many, many years, and our exposure has not stopped. We need to accept the science that is most protective of human health, include memory studies, and use the higher uncertainty factor as a multiplier that the ATSDR, New Jersey, Vermont, Pennsylvania, and New York have used in an effort to be truly protective of vulnerable populations. DES must impose far more strict and enforceable PFAS MCLs than the ones currently proposed. As we all know, there are thousands of PFAS in this chemical class. That we are even talking about setting MCLs for only 4 is unfortunate. Until we regulate these chemicals as hazardous substances and as a class, this is truly a game of whack-a-mole. The DES proposed PFAS MCLs don't take into consideration the cumulative effect of all of these toxic PFAS substances that Merrimack and the state of New Hampshire are exposed to, including PFHPA and PFBA. Given the world we now live in and what we know of advancing science, the precautionary principle should be heavily weighted as a guideline in environmental decision-making and should impact policy. DES must take preventive action in the face of uncertainty and shift the burden of proof regarding safety to those who are proponents of less restrictive and health protective MCLs. New Hampshire state government has a moral, ethical, and social responsibility to its citizens to rely upon science and the precautionary principle in the adoption of PFAS MCLs that protect human health and the environment. Science that may be funded by or thwarted by the chemical companies that have something to gain or lose, lobbyists, corporations who have profits to lose by the adoption of lower limits, or any entity that is likely to incur cost or lose profit should limits be lowered and they be required to remediate or prevent contamination, should have no voice here. We have got to get our allegiances and priorities straight. Let's put the cost where it belongs, on those responsible for putting us in this situation in the first place, those who made these toxic chemicals and those who use them, knowing full well the cost to our environment and public health. Let's stop looking at cost only from the perspective of industry and municipalities. There is a much greater cost, the one to human health and our environment. What is the value of a human life? It may not be much to a multi-billion-dollar industrial polluter, but it is everything to the parent of a child with cancer or the children of an adult who is unable to parent and too sick to provide for his or her family. We can balance economic growth and environmental protection, but it should never be at the expense of human health. In the absence of federal protections, we have asked state leaders to step up to protect public health and safety. Looking for real action and support, we have stepped up ourselves to become those leaders. Rest assured, what we have here is a public health crisis, a crisis not of our own making, that has still not been adequately addressed, and the one that continues to put the people of our community and across New Hampshire at risk of further and ongoing harm. We demand the strongest of protections for the health and well-being of our communities and environment, and inclusion of scientific studies that support this. Please don't let us down. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Murphy. That was the last of the testimony comment cards that I have here. Is there anybody here who wishes to speak who hasn't filled out a card and would like to speak now? Okay, thank you very much, all of you, for your comments and for attending. If anybody has written comments with them and has not submitted them already, please do so. If there's anything that you would like to submit after today, you can do so. I remind you that the public comment period ends on April 12th, and we will continue to take everything into consideration that we receive up until that time. Thank you very much. There being nothing further, the hearing is closed.